Welcome to Three Thoughts On. Today I'm very excited to have Clint Grauman from NuView. Clint, how are you doing today?
Great, Raphael. Thanks for having me today.
First of all, I want to thank you. I know firsthand how busy you are. We share space here in Lake Nona, and I'm excited to speak with you. I'm excited that you made time for me. Thank you for making the time. Before we get started, I'd like for you to give us a little bit of background, maybe a couple of minutes on who you are and what is it that you're doing that I am so excited for you to share with this audience.
Sure. Yeah. Like you mentioned, I'm Clint Grauman, CEO and co founder of a company called NuView. We're building a constellation of satellites that image with LiDAR, which is basically safe, invisible lasers from a sensor in space that measure the Earth extremely precisely. My background, I come from about 15 years in Earth observation, working with satellites, everything from optical imagery, like what you see on Google Earth, to radar imagery in the form of synthetic aperture radar, which can see through clouds and see at night, well as hyperspectral imagery, thermal imagery, and it's a wide world out there, and lots of different ways to understand what we do on the planet. But that's my background and my passion and what I do on a day to day basis.
That is fantastic. I am actually personally excited. My background is in engineering and telecommunications, so I am familiar with earlier versions of LiDAR, and I'm excited about what you guys are trying to do and that you will do. Can you get started with the audience? The goal of this podcast is to take potentially complicated things like this that the average person may not think is relevant to their day-to-day lives, but that they're actually very relevant to their day-to-day lives. So can you give us a summary of the overall use of the technology and how it could impact the lives of people on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. We could be here for hours if we talked about all of the ways that this data from these satellites can be used. But I usually try to bring it back to something, as you said, that affects people on a day to day basis, for things that they do in everyday life, and may not realize that satellite data or data from space affects what they do. And so, one of the ways that our information that comes from our satellites will be to understand very precisely, in the scale of centimeters, how things are positioned on the Earth. One of the really unique things about LiDAR is that when it collects imagery, it collects natively in 3D. Most of the purists out there would actually jump on the fact that I just called it imagery, because it's really a measurement with a laser, right? And if you think about, if you've ever done a do-it-yourself project at home and you've tried to measure something with a tape measure, there's this old saying, measure twice, cut once, right? And with a laser, you can get so much more precise than what you can with a ruler or a tape measure. And so that type of technology that you do with a laser measurer at home, when you do a do-it-yourself project, that real precision we're bringing to space technology to be able to image the planet and understand exactly, for example, how high mountains are, or what slope, in agriculture, that a field is. How much of that field is facing the sun so that crops can grow, and so that you can understand, if you water that crop, where's the water going to go? If you put fertilizer on it, where's that going to go? And then, in addition, there are other applications that really affect the community, the global community, like understanding how much carbon is sequestered in a forested area. Right now, when we try to understand that, much of that is done with satellite imagery that just gives us really some reflectance of what the top of the trees look like. And with LiDAR, you can see the top of the trees, you can see through the canopy down to the ground, and measure the difference in between those 2 points, the top and the bottom. You know how wide the tree is, and suddenly you can understand how much carbon, or biomass, is stored in that tree. And then you take that and apply it across an entire forest. And we can really start to understand what we're doing when deforestation happens, what we're doing when we log and use that biomass for some other purpose. And if we're trying to understand how much is really there, we go from guessing to actually accounting, for what we're doing.
Well, that is very interesting. So let me present something to you, and I'd like you to comment, critique, correct me for the sake of the audience here. So LiDAR in itself has been around for quite some time. Um, and it is something that has developed over the years from different types of models. We've scanned the surface of the oceans using a different type of lidar with green light. We've we have lidar using automation, not automation, automotives. I'm sorry, for different types of urban type of applications. And up to now, when it comes to looking at things from above, we've used drones and we've used airplanes to be able to see the Earth a little bit from above. LiDAR in the application that you guys are deploying has the potential to not only be cheaper, but also far more accurate, uh, being able to do far more land mass at any given point in time, which all of those together, at least to me, it seems like it could make the technology far more available to far more people and applications than it currently is today. Am I saying this right? Am I looking at this the right way, or can you please comment on that?
Absolutely. That's the whole premise behind why we decided to build NuView is that right now you can only image lidar from an airplane or a UAV, which gives you real problems when it comes to scale. The data is amazing. The lidar data is amazing, except you can't do very much with it. And so we're building a system that can take us from a point where we've only collected data on about 5% of the planet to being able to do the entire planet every single year. And with that, you can start to understand more accurately and more precisely about how things are changing. And by the way, that was a great comment on using LiDAR for bathymetry in water with the green laser. You're in the top 1% of people who have ever interviewed me to know that factoid.
Well, I have a history in telecommunications, but wireless cellular telephony. 27 years I was in that. So LiDAR has always been something that was interesting to me living here in the Space Coast, for 32 years. So I am a little bit of a nerd on that. So let me go back to something you said, because when you're talking about resolution of the data, right? Resolution is super important. I'm aging myself, but I remember the old days of 1G, which were the the original cellular networks, and 2G. We would use tools like MapInfo, right,
Hmm.
to load up the topology and morphology data. And I remember the day. I remember the day when we were able to purchase 3 meter data, and that
Hmm.
was the most exciting day as an engineer, when you can actually load up into a propagation tool 3 meter data and see what the model will show as far as the propagation coverage of the potential 2G, 3G data. You're talking a lot smaller than that. Can you comment on that, please?
Sure. One of the traps that the world falls into when they talk about lidar data versus optical or radar data, often people want to talk about the spatial resolution of it, and it's a very different subject when you're talking about lidar. The type of things that we try to point people to is understanding the accuracy of the data, usually in terms of vertical resolution. So, how close is that object that you're trying to image to where it's actually supposed to be in Z, or the vertical, up and down? If you're not an engineer on this call, it's how close is it supposed to be to where it is in an up and down format? And so when you're talking about resolution at 3 meters, that's the spatial. So that's like having a 3 meter grid on the ground, and that's the size of a pixel on your computer when you look at it. And so we'll be better than a meter, and that's just really how we sample things and how we grid it out. But really, the important thing about lidar is how many points or how many laser points we can send out and collect back within a meter. Can we do 2? Can we do 10? Can we do 30? And every single point that you put out there gives you a lot more um, clarity on what you're looking at, because it's all collected in 3 dimensions when you use lidar. Now, when you get to accuracy, what we're really looking to do is be accurate within about 10 centimeters as our target. And so 10 centimeters, in inches, it's a little better than a couple of inches. And we want to be able to present to the world um, a globe that's in 3 dimensions, based on LiDAR data, that we know the elevation of everything to an unbelievably precise level, and then we're going to cut it up into grids that are smaller than a meter. There are ways we can get even better than that, but we want to create the best elevation model that's ever been created, on which all other geospatial data sits on top of.
And make it do that in a commercial way, right?
Exactly.
So it becomes available for the globe, really, to then use for the myriad of applications that we know of and the ones that we don't even know of moving forward. That's, to me, to be honest with you, is one of the most exciting parts about it, is when we take technology that, you know, not necessarily in this case, but that in other cases where, governments or, the federal government develops, and but it's not available, for the
Right.
commercial world. I see this as something that could really change some of the areas that are true in my heart, like environmental monitoring and conservation. Right, my son is my middle son. He's an environmental scientist, so he reminds me every day of the importance of taking care of our planet and stuff. And I believe this is one of those technologies in that package that could allow for us to do a bit better in that field. How do you see that? How does LiDAR help environmental monitoring and conservation?
Yeah, without getting specific on the different types of lidar sensors that would need to meet each need. When you talk about lidar being able to solve problems, one of the things that we know today, based on data, is that global ice and snow water equivalents are melting, and that's going to have a huge impact on the planet. We also know that coastline is eroding, and all of the effects on the planet are making these things change. And the results of that could be catastrophic if we don't get ahead of it. And so, what we want to do from an environmental perspective is, one, we've got to start where the problem could be starting, and that's, how do we preserve carbon? How do we sequester carbon, and keep photosynthesis churning? How do we know what's actually there? Because if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, right? And so we want to give the best data that's ever been available to be able to help manage that problem. And as we start to understand coastline, the vast majority of the world's populations are close to coastline, and we want to be able to, instead of monitoring that coastline for change every few years, we want to be able to revisit that on an as required and on demand basis to understand how coastline is eroding and changing, and how people's lives are affected there. And one of the real world problems that, if you think about how that can change us, if you think about Hurricane Katrina, back in 2005, we had models for floodplains, but if we think about how we prepare for that, if we understood precisely, in the scale of centimeters, where water would most likely move should a surge come into land, that could be the difference of understanding whether the water is going to go over your ankles or whether it's going to go by the roof of your house. And the damage from that and the lives that are changed, there's a huge difference there. And so we want to be able to provide foundational geospatial data by which all environmentalists and the science community have irrefutable facts on what the baseline is and how things are changing.